I'm Lucy Ash, and I'm a maker of documentaries mainly for the radio current affairs at the BBC. And I do a lot of countries that have fallen out of the headlines but have at one point been hotspots where there's been war and conflict. And I'm quite interested in places that are post-conflict societies and how they deal with the trauma that they've been through, the legacy of violence, of people that have been forced to kill each other, neighbours, civil wars, what sort of impact that has on the rest of their lives and how they rebuild after that. For example, I've lived in Russia for quite a long time, and I wanted all the time to go to Chechnya during the Chechen wars, but it was very difficult to go there and actually talk to ordinary people because you're all the time surrounded by the Russian army who said who you could and couldn't talk to. They controlled your access very tightly. So once things had calmed down there a bit, it was very interesting to go and see what was happening. And in some respects, it looked very calm. A huge amount of Kremlin money was spent on rebuilding Grozny because Grozny looked like Dresden at the end of World War II. It was completely in ruins. When I got there were pavement cafes, there were rose bushes, there were kids roller skating, there were sushi bars. I mean, it was extraordinary. And yet, underneath the surface, there was a reign of terror still, and there were young men that were being disappeared in the middle of the night, taken out of their homes, or any of the young men that had, inverted commas, gone to the forest joining the insurgency, their families would be persecuted, their families' houses would be burned down. And the reason I went there is I made a film about bride stealing. This is just young women on their way home from school or university, or just walking down the street being snatched and bundled into a car and forcibly married. And I was sort of wondering why. I mean, they said it's an old tradition, and I was wondering why has this become so popular again. And I decided it was partly to do with the fact that many Chechens felt that they'd been humiliated in the war at the hands of the Russian army, and it was a sort of way of reasserting their masculinity, and women sort of bore the brunt of that. And it was quite interesting being there for a long time. We went to speak to lots of mullahs who are the negotiators, because in that part of Russia the law doesn't operate as it does in other parts of the territory, and you can't go to the police, that's useless. So you need to use the imam as a broker to work out how you're going to resolve the situation and whether there's a way of extracting your daughter from the clutches of this other family or not. So I like to be places for a long time and really get to know people and see unfolding stories. That's my favourite way of operating. It's not always possible with scheduled deadlines, funding and that sort of thing. I think Beyond Borders is absolutely amazing. I came in yesterday and I was very inspired by this young lawyer, Isabel Buchanan, who'd been working on death row in Pakistan. Then I was in a yacht listening to the Colombian philosopher Oscar Guadiaro Rivera about the peace process in Havana and what people in Colombia felt about it. It was very interesting to hear from him because I've just come back from there. And there's a sort of smorgasbord of delights, all kinds of different things to listen to go to. And I like the laid-back vibe. I think that's a very important part of this festival. And, of course, amazingly beautiful surroundings. I was intrigued by Tim Phillips, the neuroscientist, talking about exclusion and how that's an engine of conflict, and how we as mammals experience physical pain to be excluded from the group, and how important it is for other people to recognise what you've been through, recognise your status and give some respect to it. And I saw that in action in a theatre project in Colombia that has been started by a very famous soap opera actress there, Alejandra Borrero, called Victus, where she got together members of all the different armed groups and the victims, so the FARC, the paramilitary, the ELN, members of the Colombian army, and got them all on stage together. And people said that will never work, these people loathe each other. How on earth do you think this is a recipe for disaster? But actually it was a very illustrative and very important step in peacemaking, and not because people can immediately embrace each other, but because they listened to each other, they heard each other's stories. And one of the victims that I spoke to, who suffered a horrific ordeal at the hands of the paramilitaries, she began to understand that some of the people that had been enlisted, conscripted in their early teens, they were victims too in their own way. And in some sort of perverted logic, they thought they were doing the right thing for Colombia. The legacy of violence is horrific, and it's very difficult to overcome. But she said, like, understanding people and not just putting them in boxes, you're a guerrilla, you're a paramilitary, you're a soldier, that helped her to understand their humanity, their common humanity. But, there's also an awful lot of work to be done in terms of getting rid of the atmosphere of impunity, restoring law and order, and also for a far fairer society where people have land. The wealth gap, the Gini coefficient as it's called, is massive in Colombia. And I can't really see that there'll be real peace until there's a little bit more fairness in society. But I think these kinds of steps, using creative ideas, are very, very important to building bridges between people that you thought would never be able to communicate again.